Okay, and welcome back, students who are taking financial accounting, and we're working on this series of videos for the Chapter 2 problems, the assigned problems group in your study guide for Group B. And we left off on the last video working on problem 2-37 here. And I had, as I got to the end, when I got to this date of the 30th, I was going to work on it, but I decided when I looked at the amount of time I had spent, I was up to the 19-minute mark, so I decided that I was going to break this off and make a part 2 here for this, because these couple of entries are going to be a little bit more complicated. And so I'm just going to recap. It says here, revenues earned during the month included $12,000 in cash and $16,500 on account. Now, you know, because you're earning cash and on account, on credit, you're making a sale, so you're earning revenues, okay? That means you can make 2 different journal entries, okay? And that's fine, but you end up doing a little bit more of repetitive work, which causes, you're going to spend just a little bit more time, and there's a little bit more chance of you to make a mistake. So when you first get started, there's nothing wrong with making 2 different journal entries, date at 9:30, okay? But as you become more experienced, you're going to want to combine those 2 journal entries, okay? Then I'm going to show what I mean here, so that you can see the thought process behind it, but realize that if I were making this journal entry, in my mind, I would only make 1 journal entry, but that's because I understand the thought process, and I can easily in my mind combine them together. So whenever you're making a journal entry, ask yourself, can I affect, am I affecting cash? And in this case, yes, because I'm getting $12,000, right? So my cash is going to increase by 12,000, right? And so, I'm going to end up debiting cash for $12,000, okay? And if debits have to equal credits, well, what's the other side of the entry? Well, what am I doing? I'm making a sale and I'm earning revenue. So I look at my revenue accounts and I have a service revenue. So I'm going to credit service revenue for 12,000. Okay, so that took care of the cash portion, but I also have 16,500 on account. Okay, so the next question I ask is, is this an accounts receivable or payables? Well, when I'm making a sale and somebody's going to owe me because it's on account, that means it's going to be an accounts receivable. So my accounts receivable is going to increase by 12,000 also. I'm sorry, 16,500. Okay, so my accounts receivable is going to increase by 16,500. And the thing about accounts receivable, it's just like, treating cash. Okay, you don't have to learn something special. You don't have to memorize something special for accounts receivable. You know that accounts receivable is just like cash because cash is an asset and I'm increasing my asset on the debit side, right? So I debit my accounts receivable, and since I'm still making a sale, I'm going to credit my service revenue. Okay, and that was for 16,500. Okay. So, I mean, the point to take from that journal entry is that when I'm, if I'm working with an accounts receivable or I'm working with any asset, they all work the exact same way as cash. So if you've done enough transactions affecting cash so that you know to debit or credit it, well then yeah, you should be able to debit or credit any other asset. Okay. And if it was a liability account, such as an accounts payable or a notes payable, well, it's just the opposite. Okay. And that's how you associate and begin to internalize that information. Okay. So now what do we have here? So I've got 2 journal entries. Okay. Oh, and by the way, the cash is an asset. I'm sorry. I debited accounts receivable. And since debits must equal credits, well, then I have to credit something else. Well, yeah, I'm making that same, revenue. I'm making that, sale, so I'm earning the revenue. So I credit my service revenue for the 16.5. Now those are the two entries, okay, that I could make, and that's fine. But notice that I have two credits to service revenue, okay? And because I'm using the same account twice, yeah, I have to write it twice. Yeah, I'm going to end up posting twice. And if you're leafing through a ledger book, that does take a little bit of time. So instead of making, and of course I can make a mistake, writing numbers in and so on and so forth. So what I can do is combine those, right? Since they're both credits for 12,000 and 16,500, what I can do is I can just combine those as a, let me do it right over here, as a credit to service revenue for 28,500. Okay, and that leaves me only with my debit. So I have a debit to accounts receivable for the 16,500, and I have a debit to cash for 12,000. Okay, so that's my combined entry. It's only 3 line items, whereas this one is 4. So I've done 1 line more of entry, I've done 1 line more of posting, and I've also given myself 1 line more of the possibility of making a mistake, right? But by combining them together, because, for this transaction, okay, if I'm using the same account, okay, I can combine those together and make the journal entry. Now notice it's only applicable to this journal entry. You can't combine other transactions together, okay? In other words, if I was, let's say up here I had another service revenue transaction, okay? And maybe it was dated, let's say 9/7. Just because this one is identical to this one doesn't mean I can combine these together. No, they're totally separate transactions. You can only combine to make one journal entry when you're dealing with the same exact transaction. Okay, so if this is my 2 entries, okay, and I'm combining them together, okay, you just saw me make the entry, and actually I'm going to erase all of this and write the 1 entry. Okay, this is what the 1 entry would look like. So I would have a debit to cash for, this is the debit, and this is my credit column, for 12,000. I would have a credit to accounts receivable for 16,500. And I would have, oops, not a credit to receivable, a debit to receivable. And I would have a credit to service revenue for 16,500. No, not 16,500, 28,500. Okay, remember, debits must equal credits. Okay, so you have to add these two up. They have to equal the 28.5. Okay, so if that's what the entry looks like, okay, I'm going to erase it and I'm going to work through the process again with just using, with the way I would do it, using the more advanced thought process. It's find the right 2 entries, and when transactions get really complicated, like doing payroll or something like this, there's not a problem with creating a T account, with creating T accounts and working through things. Here's my cash. Here's my accounts receivable. Here's my revenue. Okay. If I was using a T account, I'm increasing my cash by 12,000. So I put 12,000 on the debit side for my cash. I'm increasing my accounts receivable by 16.5. Okay, so I put 16.5 on my debit side. That means I have to have 28,500 on my credit side for my revenue, right? So notice what I did is I combined those two totals to get 28.5 there. I mean, yes, I could have written 12,000 and 16.5, okay, there. But that's not helping me work through in my mind getting a total of the revenue, okay? If I dealt with the cash and I dealt with the accounts receivable, then since I'm making sales for both, all I need to do is just add these two up, right? Add these two up, which is what I get over here, the 28.5, when I go to make my journal entry. So that's using a T account, and if it was a really, really complicated transaction, yeah, every account will use T accounts in order to be able to figure things out, and they do it on the side. And then they'd come back into their journal and they'd go ahead and they'd make their journal entry. Here I'm going to debiting my cash for the 12,000, and I'm going to credit debit, sorry, did that again. I'm going to debit my accounts receivable for 16,500, and of course, if I'm going to credit my service revenue, okay, right, I would then just add these two numbers together and get 28,500. And I would have backed into my credit, and I would have totaled these up to figure out what my amount of my credit would be to the service revenue, even though it doesn't tell me in this transaction what that service revenue amount would be. Okay? And so that's how I would have mentally gone and created my journal entry. I would have asked myself, am I affecting cash? Yes, it's increasing by 12,000. Boom, debit. Okay? Then I'm saying, okay, am I affecting accounts receivable? Yes. Am I, it's going up by 16.5. Yes. So there's my debit to accounts receivable. And then debits must equal credits. Well, I'm adding those up. And what am I going to credit? My service revenue. Boom, there's my service revenue, and that's the amount for my credit, and I have the correct journal entry without having to think any more about it. Okay? So that's that transaction. Again, if you didn't understand it, go back and watch the videos again, watch from the beginning again, go back to the theory videos, watch those a few times, and if you still don't understand something, feel free to call. Okay. So the next transaction says paid employee salaries, 3,240, office rent 1,800, and utilities 675. Okay. So this here is kind of like the same thing again. Okay, I can make separate transactions here. All right. So since I'm paying and I'm going to be paying out cash, here's my cash, and I'm going to be decreasing my cash. Well, if I'm decreasing my cash, that means I'm going to credit my cash for, in this case here, $3,240 for salaries. These are for the operation of the business. So I have salary expense, rent expense, utility expense. So I would debit salaries expense for $3,200. Okay, and that's one part of the transaction. Okay, then I could go and make a second journal entry. I'm paying office rent for $1,800, so my cash is going to decrease by $1,800, and that's for rent expense of $1,800, and that's a second journal entry that I could make. And then I'm going to pay utilities for $675, so I'm decreasing my cash by $675, and I'm paying utility expense for $675. Now, that's a third journal entry that I would have made. Okay, but again, if you had the, I'm going to do it up here, a debit to salary for $32.40, and a credit to cash for $32.40, a debit to rent for $1,800, a credit to cash for $1,800, and a debit to utility for $675, and a credit to cash for $675. Okay. Well, if I had written out all three of those entries and I'm looking at them, what do I see? Oh, I see remember, this is all the same transaction here for the 30th, right? And I see, oh, I have a credit to cash here, a credit to cash here, and a credit to cash here. Okay, well, I could just then combine those entries and say I have a credit to cash for, what is it, 3,240, 1,800 and 675 is 57.15. Whoops, 57.15. Okay, and what am I left with? Well, I'm left with a debit to salaries expense for $32.40, a debit to rent expense for $1,800, and a debit to utilities expense for $675. And now I've combined all of my journal, I combined all of these journal entries together to make just one journal entry here. Okay, that's one way. That's another way. And notice I'm, my progressions here. Okay, now I'm going to end up with the same entry here. Okay, but again, if you had T accounts, right, I'd have cash, I'd have salaries expense, rent expense, and utilities expense. So for my cash, I'd end up with a $32.40 as a credit and a debit for $32.40. I'd have a $1,800 for a credit, and that's $1,800 for the rent, and $675 as a credit for the utilities. And of course I add those all together and I get $57.15, which is what I would use to make my journal entry. Okay, so with that said, if I'm trying to combine in my mind, okay, I know I'm paying cash, and if I know that my cash, I'm going to credit my cash for some amount, then let me go back and work on my debits. So I'm debiting the salaries expense for $32.40. I'm debiting rent expense for $1,800, and I'm debiting utility expense for $675. And since I know debits have to equal credits, I add these up and stick that in here as $57.15. Okay, and that's how I mentally combine my journal entries all together all at the same time without having to write them all out and then combine them. Okay, and again, I could have used the T accounts on the side, which is in essence kind of like doing this also, except it allows me to see the cash account with the amounts here so that I can make a balance and so I can get my balance over here. Okay, so that's how I go about that and for that entry. All right, and let's see here, let me erase the rest of this and we'll get down to that last journal entry. Okay. Okay, so we're done with that, and I have a credit here. Okay, so this last entry, paid $4,300 in dividends to stockholders of Dalton. So I ask myself, a lot of people jump to the second half of the journal entries, the dividends, the salaries, the office, the supplies, the common stock. Okay, don't work from the last half of the entry. Ask yourself, am I affecting cash? So yes, I'm paying $4,300 in cash out, so I'm decreasing my cash by $4,300. As we know, when I decrease my cash, I'm going to credit my cash for $4,300, and then all I need to do is just find whatever account, since debits must equal credits, I find whatever account. In this case here, it's a dividends. That's what we're paying out. I look at my chart of accounts, and dividend is an equity account, so I have common stock and I have dividends. So I'm going to debit my dividend for $4,300, and that's the journal entry for that. Basically just the opposite of that first entry that we made for the common stock. Okay, notice that that first entry, we were purchasing, someone was purchasing common stock, so we had gotten cash. We increased our cash. Okay, but when we do dividends, we're paying out our cash, right? We're decreasing our cash, and we're using that common stock account and the dividend account, and that's kind of how we deal with the equity section, at least in this stage of the game. Okay, later on when you get into more advanced accounting, yeah, it gets more complicated, but right now that's all you need to know for the equity section. So that's our journal entry, and that's it for this problem, and I'll see you in the next problem. And since we've covered these multiple entries here, multiple line entries here, I'm not going to be going over them so much in the next problem. Okay, right, we'll see you then.